When I say the name Benedict Arnold, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? I know, traitor. Well, do you know that that traitor has a backstory? Everything has a backstory. Well, that backstory is captured in a wonderful new book. Behind every great man, there is a great woman. And wait till you hear about the woman behind Benedict Arnold. My name is Vin Dacquino. Our next guest, Allison Pataki. Allison, oh man, I loved your book.
Thank you.
And I loved your lecture.
Thank
Came
you.
to hear you talk. Man, there were things about him that I didn't even dream of. Tell me a little bit, though, first about you. You're into writing now.
Yes.
Who is Allison Pataki?
Yes, so I am a lover of history.
Yeah.
I am a lover of great stories, whether I hear them from the person across the table from me or in a historical account. I love to read great fiction, great historical fiction, and I hope I am now someone who's written a worthy story in my first book, The Traitor's Wife.
A good book. So The Traitor's Wife. And basically what you're saying is behind this man, there is a story.
Absolutely.
Tell me first a little bit about what attracted you to Benedict Arnold in the first place. Now, he lived not too far from where you grew up, right?
Exactly, exactly. In fact, he lived just down the road from where I grew up in Phillipstown. So when he was the military commander of West Point, which was the pivotal fort during the Revolutionary War, it was the place that George Washington called the key to the continent. And it was also the fort that the British recognized if they could control West Point, they could control the Hudson, which was the critical waterway. And so growing up, as we did in Phillipstown and on the Hudson River, we were always sort of given a front row to history, specifically Revolutionary War history. And so I knew, for instance, that George Washington slept in my neighbor's home. I knew that Benedict Arnold lived across the street when he was the military commander of West Point.
Of course, you also knew that George Washington slept about everywhere.
Everywhere,
There's a
exactly.
guy who slept everywhere.
Exactly. He slept in a lot of beds during the Revolutionary War. But we were also very aware of the fact that this history relating to Benedict Arnold and his treason, or his attempted treason.
In this case, he actually did sleep there.
Yes, and lived right there. And so growing up in the area, I knew who Benedict Arnold was. I knew who John Andre was, the British spy with whom Benedict Arnold had conspired.
There's a real strange connection there.
Exactly, exactly. But what really tipped me off to the fact that, as you said, there was a really great backstory here was when I discovered that Benedict Arnold was married and that his wife was not only a participant in the attempted plot to turn over West Point, but that she was actually, you could say, the integral character in facilitating it. And so once I started to do a little bit of research on her, I realized what you've just said, which is
she was
there's
like
great
a
story.
society woman, right?
Yes, yes. So in her former life, she was a Philadelphia socialite, a debutante, if you will, one of the belles of Philadelphia high society.
Now, her maiden name was?
Her name was Shippen. So she was Peggy Shippen of a very prominent Philadelphia and Pennsylvania family, the daughter of a judge, related to a lot of the leading members of, old money. And when I found a portrait of her at the age of 17, a drawing with her beautiful Marie Antoinette hair and her beautiful gown.
Like 5 feet of hair above her head.
Exactly. I saw under the engraving that it was drawn by Major John Andre. And that name was familiar, and I was thinking to myself, isn't Major John Andre the same man with whom her husband later conspired?
Yeah.
And so I said, how did she know? He was hanged, yes. And Major John Andre, you know, was the other player. Benedict Arnold escaped. John Andre was caught and hanged. But I thought it was very curious that he was drawing a 16 or 17-year-old Peggy's portrait. And I said, what's their backstory? What's their relationship? And sure enough, she was the one who had the history with John Andre and had facilitated the introduction.
So they were a thing.
He was a suitor of hers. It's unclear the extent of their relationship, but they certainly had a romantic relationship.
When she was relatively young.
When she was a teenager in Philadelphia, when the British occupied Philadelphia early in the war, Major John Andre was this dashing officer who was...
So was he older?
He was a little bit older. Not
but
quite as much of an age difference between those two as there was between Benedict Arnold and Peggy.
Oh, so Benedict Arnold was considerably older than Peggy?
He was twice her age when they met and got married. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. he was more than twice her age. He was 38 and she was 18.
Wow.
Yes. But John Andre was her paramour in this early life before she'd ever known or married Benedict Arnold.
So she sort of got him involved in this. What,
Yes.
did Andre get her involved, or did she get Andre involved?
Unclear. After the British and John Andre were driven out of Philadelphia, and Benedict Arnold came in and was the military commander of Philadelphia, and the colonials then had occupation of Philadelphia, that's when Peggy and Benedict began their relationship. But she had always kept in touch with John Andre, and they wrote, and he rose up through the ranks in the British intelligence network and became the chief of intelligence, and one of his chief jobs was to recruit spies. So what is likely the case, and what the historians assert, is that Peggy, who had always had loyalist tendencies, as she saw her husband Benedict Arnold becoming more and more bitter with the cause and with some of his colleagues, and more impoverished and more desperate, she likely encouraged him to reach out to her old friend, who, by the way, happened to be in charge of recruiting spies for the British. And she certainly facilitated the introduction that began their letter writing and their correspondence.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. So, pretty interesting backstory.
Yes.
What other revelations now? So there was a pretty clear one. Remind us again what this was all about.
Yes.
That he was trying to sell plans to West Point, to the British. He was bitter at the time. So fill us in a little bit.
Yes.
On that story.
So one of the things that was obviously very interesting about researching the story was the backstory that involved Peggy Shippen, but I think equally as interesting is the backstory about Benedict Arnold and how he got from patriot and hero to traitor who was trying to turn over the fort.
Because
and
he
the
certainly
cause
fell out of grace.
Exactly. So he had been early on arguably the best general in the colonial side. He was one of George Washington's favorites.
In my research, when I was doing Sybil Ludington, The Call to Arms, he had his horse shot out from under him and was almost killed.
Yes.
And pulled out his gun when he was told, "You were a prisoner," and he said, "Not yet. I'm not." And he shot the British soldier. I mean, he was an incredible military man.
He was. That was undisputed, and that was in Connecticut, right, in the Battle of Ridgefield.
Battle of Ridgefield.
And similarly, in another battle, he actually famously shot his own horse out from underneath him to prevent it from getting into British hands as he boarded an escape ship.
God.
But yeah,
I didn't hear that.
His bravery was definitely undisputed. He was the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, which was the turning point of the Revolutionary War. Had the colonials lost the Battle of Saratoga, they would have lost access again to the Hudson River. The colonies would have been divided amongst the North and the South and New England, and that was really the pivotal moment in the war. And Benedict Arnold was the pivotal figure in that battle, as he was in many other major battles. And so his military record was undisputed. George Washington admired him greatly. He had been shot twice in the left leg and walked with excruciating pain, actually probably should have been amputated, but refused to give up his leg.
Wow.
So his valor is without a doubt.
I mean, he was an incredible military leader.
Certainly, and a brilliant tactician and a very brave leader, and his men loved him. But on the personal side, he had a very bombastic personality. He made enemies virtually every place he went. He made enemies with fellow generals, but also with the civilian leaders of the revolution. He didn't have the tact that the other leaders like George Washington had in negotiating human relationships. So because of this, he was constantly passed over for promotions by the Continental Congress because he had a few powerful enemies there. So that made him bitter. He also had spent a lot of his own personal fortune in paying his men, feeding his men, financing these military campaigns. And as we know, the Continental Congress was broke. They could barely finance the war, let alone reimburse a general for his own personal out-of-pocket expenses.
So Peggy Shippen, who was used to being treated in a royal way, was not being treated in a royal way anymore.
And so as Benedict Arnold, kind of the backdrop of these military conquests, but these personal battles that he's already starting to fight, and the physical pain he feels from his injuries to his leg. This is the backdrop when he comes into Philadelphia as the military commander and begins to woo Peggy Shippen. And what he does in Philadelphia is, he, as the military commander, he spotted the opportunity to do a little bit of profiteering and black market trading to make some money back, and to be able to finance this very expensive new wife that he's just fallen in love with. And so what happened was he closed all the shops under the auspices that they were British goods that had been ordered by British generals and British loyalists. But he actually seized all of the goods and sold them on the black market.
Oh, wow.
And this got him into a lot of trouble, even more trouble. He was court-martialed. His name was kind of dragged through the mud. And George Washington, who had been his constant ally in every sort of feud beforehand, was very disappointed. And the court-martial found Benedict Arnold guilty of some of these charges of profiteering, but the punishment was relatively light. It was a censure by George Washington.
Slap on the wrist.
A slap on the wrist.
Yep.
And George Washington issued the censure just because he had to follow the protocol and he had to mete out the punishment. But it was, even that was very light. He wrote a letter praising Benedict Arnold for his military career and just saying that he wished that in his personal life he had behaved with the same sort of decorum. So even that was very light. But at this point, you've got public slander to his name. You've got very many years of debt because of overspending and not being reimbursed for his service.
No, he was relatively young.
Yes, he was in his late 30s at this point. And he had an even younger wife, and he had a wife who happened to be a loyalist, and who claimed, you know, to friends and in her own private life, she claimed that she really worked hard to show her husband the other way, another side of things. And so he's a bitter man at this point. He's in pain. He's fallen out sort of with many of the other generals. He's gotten this slap on the wrist by his hero, George Washington. He sees his days on the battlefield is over because of his debilitating injuries. And so he was embittered and very prone to these tempting arguments about the other side that might treat him more genteelly.
Now, did Andre have an appearance here? I mean, did he go to the house? I mean,
yes.
Oh,
yes.
So they knew each other.
They met. The initial correspondence happened entirely through letters, where they wrote in a secret code, and you can see Benedict Arnold's handwriting, John Andre's handwriting, and Peggy Shippen's handwriting. At one point in one of the letters, Peggy Shippen even asks John Andre, who's in New York with the rest of the British, for some pink lace. And we're unclear of if that was a code for something or if she was just reverting to her old ways, right? But they had a while where they were corresponding through couriers in coded letters, and initially the British actually wanted Benedict Arnold to give them information on the port of Charleston in South Carolina. But as they got further along in conversations, they realized that really the big crown jewel that they needed in order to finally break this colonial rebellion was West Point. So they said, if you can get us if you can arrange for the turnover of the fort at West Point, we will reward you very handsomely, the equivalent of what's over $1 million today.
Whoa.
And a promotion in the British Army and a very warm reception into the British side. And so Benedict Arnold used his friendship with George Washington and sort of played on George Washington's sympathies and saying, you know, because my leg is wounded so badly and I will never be able to return to the battlefield, I really would like this post, this plum post as commander of West Point. And George Washington honored his friend's request.
So his whole reason for becoming commander of West Point was to sell it out.
Absolutely. He intended, when he moved up here to West Point, to turn it over. And that's when he and John Andre met for the first time, once he was up here.
And then they discussed what was going to happen.
The compensation.
And pretty much it was the blueprint of West Point.
Yes.
So they could figure out how to get in, how to get out.
Yes. Yes. So in their illicit midnight meeting on the Hudson in this area of no man's land down by Haverstraw, down by just north of New York City where the British were, Benedict Arnold handed him pages and pages of highly, highly top secret colonial documents. So how many men were at each position on West Point, the plan to defend West Point in the case of a British attack, which forts and outposts were susceptible to cannon fire versus which of those who could be set on fire, could be burned, made of wood. He gave blueprints, he gave maps, he planned to weaken all of the defenses, including the chain that was going across the Hudson. He basically handed him over everything that he needed in order to stage a successful British attack that would have led to...
It never happened.
It never happened. It never happened because John Andre put all of these top secret documents after this meeting. He put them in his stockings, in his boots, and set off to go back across no man's land, back towards the British, and was apprehended with all of these plans. So it never came to fruition.
Wow.
Yes.
So he was caught.
Yes, he was caught.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So it was very, very dramatic how it all went down. And when I was set out to write The Traitor's Wife, I didn't know how heavily I would rely on the history and how much of it would be fiction. But as I discovered this skeleton of facts, I thought I'd be crazy not to rely on these facts.
Did you find a lot of contradictions?
In the historical record? It's relatively well documented how the actual day of went down because so many people were there and took very thorough notes. But so what happened was John Andre and Benedict Arnold had this illicit meeting late in September down in no man's land. And Benedict Arnold took off back up the Hudson towards Garrison where he was commander.
On his boat?
Yes, on a little barge that he had. And John Andre was intending to get back to his warship, his British warship, the Vulture, and row back down to the British lines at New York City. And what happened while they were at this meeting was some colonials actually fired on John Andre's boat, the Vulture. So the Vulture turned tail, went back down the Hudson, leaving John Andre stranded in no man's land.
Oh my God.
So John Andre now had no choice but to make his way back to the British post. The nearest British post was at White Plains. He was going to have to make his way overland because his boat was gone. So John Andre and Benedict Arnold bid farewell. Benedict Arnold makes it back up to his post up the Hudson, and John Andre takes off on horseback through this wilderness of no man's land and highway robbers, and there are patrols that are favorable to the British, and there are patrol groups that are favorable to the colonials, and John Andre takes off his British uniform to make his way and gets into plain clothes, and he's just a few miles from the line where he would have crossed back over into his safe British territory. And 3 militiamen who are favorable to the colonial side stop him. And one of them happens to be wearing a Hessian uniform, which the Hessians had previously fought with the British.
With the British, right.
So John Andre sees this Hessian uniform and thinks that he's in luck. So he greets the men and he says, good day to them. And he asks, which party are you? And they ask him, which party are you? And he says, I'm from the lower party, of course, which the lower party was shorthand, which only the British would have known, meaning the British controlled the lower half of the Hudson.
Right.
So they referred to themselves as the lower party. So he says, I'm from the lower party, and you, and they play along and they say, we're of the lower party as well. So then he goes on to brag about what he's doing. He explains that he's on a top secret mission for the British. He's carrying top secret information from Benedict Arnold, the local colonial commander. And that's when they realize that they have a spy on their hands. So they arrest him. They take him to a nearby fort. They search him. They find all of these plans in his boots.
Oh my God.
Now, coincidentally, as this is all happening, George Washington is coming to the area because he's in the area to inspect the local forts, and he's just come from a meeting with the French High Command, the French allies in Hartford, Connecticut. So with these top secret documents that have been pulled off of Andre, the local commander has a choice. He can send them up the chain of command to his local commander, who is Benedict Arnold, which obviously would have been great for John Andre, or he can send them to George Washington, who he knows is in the area. He's not quite sure which to do, so he splits. He sends a letter to Benedict Arnold explaining that this man has been apprehended under these suspicious circumstances with these very troubling documents in his boots, and that he has a pass to cross over the British lines signed by Benedict Arnold. And he says, and I've sent all of these papers and information on his capture to George Washington as well. So 2 couriers set out.
Whoa.
One is going to Arnold and one is going to George Washington. Now, George Washington had been coming to the area and was planning to arrive at Benedict Arnold's home for breakfast. And he was excited to have breakfast with one of his favorite commanders, as well as the famous Mrs. Arnold, who George Washington said half of his men were in love with Mrs. Arnold. She was a well-known beauty. And so he, at the last minute, makes a detour and decides to go by way of Fishkill as opposed to by way of Salem. So the courier doesn't find him in time to give him this information.
Wow.
And the other courier reaches Benedict Arnold before George Washington has gotten there.
Wow.
So Benedict Arnold finds out that his ally, John Andre, has been taken in, that all of the documents are now on their way to George Washington, and that the pass that he signed is also on the way to George Washington. And he knows it's only a matter of time before the High Commander connects the dots. So he's at his home fretting, and he gets a notice from his aide that George Washington's on his way up, that he's just about to come up to the house. So I pictured this very dramatic moment where Benedict Arnold knows that all is lost. And it's documented that he told his wife, all is lost. His dreams for glory and for changing the entire course of the Revolutionary War are shot. His obviously his days of serving for George Washington and the Colonial Army are done. Now he just needs to survive. So he's running out the back door while George Washington is coming up the front door. He leaves his wife behind as a diversion, and he rows himself down to the Vulture and defects to the British. And Peggy Arnold, his wife, is left to entertain George Washington and to distract
And it wasn't
them.
only George Washington, right?
It was George Washington, Alexander Hamilton,
Oh, my
the
God.
Marquis de Lafayette. All of these power players in American history were part of this retinue that were coming to the Arnold home that morning.
Oh my God.
Yes.
And he's running down the path, which is amazing because
Yes.
I walked that path with you.
Yes, Arnold's flight.
That's no path.
Right.
That's a long haul through the woods,
Right.
down the mountainside,
Right.
rocky.
Right.
How he did it with all that pain in
Yes.
his leg,
Yes.
I don't know how he could have done it.
Horse. He galloped on horseback.
There you go.
Yeah, and
So
just
the
made
horse
it.
had to go through. So he gets on the Vulture,
Yes.
and off he goes.
Yes, and he defects. And meanwhile, the Vulture's there waiting for John Andre. They haven't seen him. They have no idea what's happened to their British spy, who is supposed to have met them days earlier, because their British spy is detained in a
So the
prison.
Vulture was hanging out at Arnold's.
Right by Croton, where Croton is, Teller's Point, right in no man's land.
Okay, so they pick up
Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold
Yes.
instead.
Yes.
And they take him. So what happens?
So back at the house, Peggy Arnold is feigning complete innocence. And so whether it was genuine or also part of her act, she broke out into a hysterical fit. Well, let me backtrack. First, when George Washington first gets there, he doesn't know yet, but Peggy does. So she plays very innocent. So eventually, later on that day, the road-weary messenger finally catches up to George Washington with this news. And George Washington gets the letter explaining what happened, and he said, Arnold has betrayed us. In whom can we ever trust? Because Benedict Arnold was one of his most trusted and allies and confidants.
Washington stuck his neck out for him a few times.
Yes, absolutely. And so this really hit him very hard. And so Peggy Arnold breaks into hysterics, and it's recorded that the men in the house saw her tearing at her hair and tearing at her nightgown and saying that George Washington and the men in her home are going to kill her child. And she gets taken to bed by these men, and they soothe her. Alexander Hamilton, who is apparently very romantic, brings her flowers from the garden. They beg her not to go back to her husband. They beg her to cut ties with him completely and to return to her home in Philadelphia, her parents' home. And so they sort of nurse her back to health. And meanwhile, they also are furious with Benedict Arnold, understandably, and George Washington dispatches some men down the river to try to catch him and, you know, try him as a spy. But they never catch him. Benedict Arnold slips away. Peggy Arnold slips away without anyone ever knowing the role. And John Andre was the one who was hanged.
Wow. So then the end story of Benedict Arnold is pretty sad too.
Yes, yes.
So what happens there?
So once he officially joined the British ranks, he fought for a time on the British side during the Revolutionary War. And when the war was over, he and Peggy and their children sailed to England. And their dreams of being welcomed into high British society and going to the court were briefly realized. They had a brief introduction to the royal family.
How many children
at court.
did they have?
They had 6 surviving children.
Ooh.
She bore him 8 children.
Wow. Wow.
Yes. But eventually in London, they faced the same sort of troubles that they had started off their marriage with, which was They were in constant debt. Benedict Arnold tried his hand for a time at trade, which had been his craft before the Revolutionary War. He had some success, but again, feuded constantly with business partners and with rivals, and he was a big duelist. He got in multiple duels in his life.
Wow.
Was not really liked by London society. Relocated with the family for a time to Canada, but was also run out of town there because of personal enemies he made, and ended up dying in London. An impoverished man, a man who was not very well liked, and the legend has it that in his last moments, he asked God to forgive him for having ever traded in his first uniform. Now, who knows if that actually happened, but it's sad to think that he most likely lived with that regret for the rest of his life.
Sure he
yes,
did.
Yes. And another fun rumor, which again is unsubstantiated, but which I thought was intriguing, was that Peggy Shippen Arnold had a lock of John Andre's hair until the day she died.
Wow. So this is an interesting story.
Yes.
Now, the name of the book is
The Traitor's Wife.
The Traitor's Wife, and the biggest focus is on Peggy.
Absolutely.
But what a wonderful historical story. And it's a tragedy. It really is a tragedy. You know, that a man of his ability should sell it all.
Yes.
And all it takes is one bad mistake.
Yes.
And he certainly made that mistake.
Right.
Well, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And it's a wonderful piece of history.
Yes.
And where do you go from here?
I plan to keep writing historical fiction.
Wonderful. Well, do you have any ideas in mind?
I have my next one in the works, and it will be another historical fiction that will be a time period that people are familiar with, but told from the perspective of a leading lady that was.
So you're not even gonna give us a little teaser?
Soon, I hope soon.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Now, speaking of soon, your book really isn't technically out yet, is it?
February 11th.
Wow, February 11th. Did you hear that? You know what you have to do, right? You better keep watching for that book because The Traitor's Wife will be out soon.
Yes.
And hopefully it'll be in all the stores.
Yes.
And it'll get the kind of response we really would like.
I would love that.
And in the meantime, you're going to be busy. When do you do all your writing?
When I'm in a period where I finish the research and I'm working on a book, it's my day job. So if I have a day where I can devote to writing, I get very much consumed in the process, and
which is a good idea.
I can do it all day.
Have you already started the new book?
Oh yes.
Oh wow!
Yep.
Well, can't wait to see it. Well, you better promise to come back here when that happens.
I would love that.
We'd love to see you, and we are so pleased that you came here today to join us. It's a wonderful story.
Thank you.
And it's a book well worth getting. So that's what you need to do. And in the meantime, we want to thank you very much for joining us here today. Go out and get The Traitor's Wife as soon as it comes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. It has been a pleasure.
Mine too.